Hello runners, this is David McHenry, physical therapist and the director of the Therapeutic Associates Biomechanics Lab. Today is the fifth installment of the six-part series that we are calling Biomechanical Minutes. And today we're going to be dealing with pelvic injuries. And we're going to go over four biomechanical variables that we are seeing significantly increase the likelihood of developing one of these three kind of subcategories of pelvic injuries that we're going to talk about. In men, we are seeing that these biomechanical variables are increasing likelihood of sacroiliac joint irritation or injury. And in women, we are seeing that it can manifest both as sacroiliac joint dysfunction or also a stress fracture in one of two areas. One area is the femoral neck, which is kind of the bony bridge between the shaft of the femur and the socket of the hip itself. And then the other is a sacral stress fracture that can happen very close to the sacroiliac joint. And we do see this happening in men, but we see the likelihood of it happening in women far greater, just because of the inherent anatomical differences in the lumbopelvic girdle in women compared to men. So we're going to go through the four biomechanical variables that predispose runners to these categories of injuries. So we are going to be looking primarily at the spine and pelvis for three of these, and then we're going to look at some landing mechanics for one of them. So we'll start with the spine and the pelvis. And here we are looking at our runner, and we're looking at the pelvis in the frontal plane, which is where we get left and right side bending, and we're looking at it in the transverse plane where we get left and right rotation. And we're going to stop this, and we are going to back it up, and we are going to look first at the frontal plane mechanics. And we can see here in our runner that she is getting about 10 degrees of a left contralateral pelvic drop. She's getting about 0 degrees of a right contralateral pelvic drop. So we're going to actually see when this is occurring. So we're going to go forward until we hit one of those peak pelvic drops, which is right about here. So here she is in maximum left side bending of the pelvis. Right now she's in 8 degrees of a left contralateral pelvic drop. She gets as much as 10 degrees. And we can visualize what's going on right here because we're looking at the orientation of the right PSIS, or the bony landmark in the back of the right side of the pelvis, compared to the left PSIS. We can see that the left PSIS is dipping down quite a bit in comparison to the right side. And this is happening, this peak contralateral pelvic drop is happening right when our runner is in mid stance on the right side. So go back to that pelvis orientation. And what's happening here is as our runner loads the right leg, she's losing some of that pelvic stability, likely because of either weakness or inhibition in some of the posterior musculature of this right hip. And this is going to do a couple of different things. It changes how stress is attenuated through the sacrum, through the SI joint, and through the femoral neck. It also changes the orientation of the pelvis so that now she's getting more of a shearing stress through the SI joint, just because we change the orientation of that joint surface in relationship to vertical. So this is the first thing that we look at as a biomechanical variable that increases the likelihood of that sacroiliac stress issue or potential sacral stress fractures or reactions in femoral neck stress fractures and reactions. The second thing we're going to look at, we're going to stay focusing on the pelvis, and we're going to look at the pelvis in the transverse plane. And we can see here in our runner that she's getting about 8 degrees of a left rotation as she's running. She's getting 2 degrees of a right rotation when she's running. 8 degrees is a little bit too much. 2 degrees is not quite as much as we would like to see. And what we would see, and she doesn't actually present with this, but normally if we see both a contralateral pelvic drop and an excessive rotation to the right, then we start to get even more concerned, because then we have two different variables that are starting to indicate the potential of developing SI joint irritabilities or those sacral stress fractures or the femoral neck stress fractures. She's getting an excessive left rotation, which is putting the left side a little bit more vulnerable. So she doesn't have that same kind of a correlation that we would see. But the excessive rotation is one of the things that we're looking at as one of the biomechanical variables. Next, we're going to look at the spine. And just for a little orientation, here we're looking at the right PSIS, the bony landmark on the back of the right side of the pelvis. Left PSIS, we're looking at the midpoint of the sacrum, that little blue dot right there. And then this red dot is right at the interface between the cervical spine and the thoracic spine. And the system is grabbing the spinous process, which is a bony landmark right on the back of the vertebral body. And it is dropping a black line straight down, perfect vertical or a plumb line, so that we can look at torso orientation in relationship to the midpoint of the sacrum and the right and the left PSIS. Now we are going to progress forward, and as the runner progresses onto the left leg, which is what our runner is doing here, we'll see that we get a left lateral shift of her torso over the midpoint of the sacrum. A little bit of this is normal and natural. If it becomes excessive, it becomes a little bit concerning. So right now, if we look at this as a metric of angular displacement, we can see that our runner is in about 5 degrees of a left lateral shift of her torso over her midpoint of her sacrum as she loads her left leg. We have identified within our biomechanics lab that 4 degrees is the high end of normal, so 5 degrees is starting to get a little bit excessive. If we come back to the right side, we'll do the same thing. We'll look for that peak right lateral shifting, and looks to be right about here. We come up, and right now she's in 4 degrees of a right lateral shift. However, if we come over here, we can actually see that she gets a maximum of 6 degrees of a right lateral shift during one stride, at least within this study. She gets as much as 6 degrees of a left lateral shift. And we will go one more slide each way just to visualize that. Not a lot of shifting there on that particular step. And this right side, not a lot either. So it's actually inconsistent as well. So some strides she has an excessive lateral shift, other strides she does not. But that excessive lateral shifting in relationship to the midpoint of the sacrum, in addition to that excessive contralateral pelvic drop, and we can see that here, that big drop of the left PSIS in relationship to the right PSIS, is the third biomechanical variable that we're starting to see increase the likelihood of these pelvis injuries in our runners. Okay, last thing that we're going to look at is slow motion video analysis. And we are going to watch our pressure plate here, and we're going to watch left initial contact. So we're going to go forward until we see the presence of pressure, and we see the presence of pressure right about here. And this is initial contact on the left side. So we're going to go to the left lateral view, and we're going to look at what her knee position is at initial contact. So her knee flexion angle at initial contact on this left side is 18 degrees, which is really pretty good. The knee functions as a really nice spring to help attenuate the vertical impact force of our body coming crashing down onto the ground. What the research suggests, including the research from the University of Salford, which is the article that I pointed out in last week's installment, we want to see no less than 10 degrees of knee flexion at initial contact. On the left side, she looks really pretty good. 18 degrees of knee flexion is right within the sweet spot that we know that her knee is going to be able to function to help decelerate that vertical impact force and prevent that force from being driven up into the pelvis. So let's go back and look at the left side. So we're going to go through this stride. She's at toe off right here, and then the next presence of pressure is going to be initial contact on the left side, which is what we're seeing, or I'm sorry, on the right side. So we're going to go to the right lateral view, and we'll see where she is here. So now she's at 5 degrees of flexion at initial contact. So that's quite a bit different on the right side than it is the left side, and that is definitely below that 10-degree threshold that we've identified as normal. So what happens here is if the knee is too extended at initial contact, the knee can function as well as that kind of vertical spring to help decelerate some of that vertical impact force. So the force gets driven right up into the pelvis. Both the femoral neck and the SI joint and that sacral base. So this is the fourth of the 4 biomechanical variables that we are starting to see increases likelihood of pelvic injuries. And to tie it all together for our particular runner, she has 3 of the 4 on one side. So she has the limited knee flexion angle on the right side, which is what we said was one of the variables. She also has the excessive contralateral pelvic drop as she goes into mid stance. So right now her pelvis is relatively neutral, and we can kind of see that here. But as she loads that leg, we'll see that she loses that frontal plane stability of her pelvis, and she gets that big excessive contralateral pelvic drop. So that's the second thing that we said increase the likelihood of pelvic injuries in our runners. We also identified the coronal imbalance, or the right lateral shifting of that black line in relationship to the midpoint of the sacrum. This particular stride, she's at 4 degrees, which is the high end of normal, but we know that she gets as high as 6 degrees. So that's 3 of the biomechanical variables that we are starting to become suspicious, increased likelihood of pelvic injuries. And then the last was pelvic rotation. And in her case, if we were really concerned about the right side, it would be excessive right pelvic rotation. But she's actually getting a little bit of an excessive left pelvic rotation. So on the right side, she has 3 of the 4 categories, and on the left side, only 1 of the 4 categories. So for me, I would be far more concerned about right side pelvis issues, femoral neck stress fractures, sacral iliac joint dysfunctions, or sacral stress reactions in our particular runner. So there you go. Thank you for tuning in. I've had a lot of fun doing this. Hopefully you are gaining some knowledge as you watch these. If you have any questions, as always, let us know, and we will do our best to answer them. Thank you.